Great. Well, hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's event, Accelerating Federal, State, and Local Investments in the U.S. Infrastructure Workforce. My name is Joe Kane. I'm a fellow at the Brookings Metro program. To both our in-person audience and our webcast viewers, I'm excited that you'll be able to hear from a terrific set of speakers on this important issue facing the country. But our main goal today is not simply to elevate the importance or celebrate what is possible as hundreds of billions of dollars in new federal funding flows across the country, whether from the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, or IIJA, the Inflation Reduction Act, or IRA, or the CHIPS and Science Act, to name only a few of the largest pieces of legislation. Rather, we want to get down to brass tacks. We recognize a year plus in since the passage of the EJA that there are real struggles facing both infrastructure leaders and workforce leaders to access and maximize the impact of this funding. Too many people in too many places are still confused about what this federal funding means for workers, how it can reach them, and how eligible entities for this funding, including employers, can actually use it. We will have two panels, one focusing on federal perspectives, moderated by myself, and the other on state and local perspectives, moderated by my colleague Martha Ross, to unpack exactly what these struggles are and strategies to address them. Both panels also intentionally have infrastructure and workforce leaders represented, highlighting the needed leadership and action from both. Before we get to our panel discussions, though, I wanted to spend a few minutes laying out some context based on two new Brookings reports that help define the scope of the country's infrastructure workforce challenges and the hurdles facing leaders as they look to take advantage of new funding. First, last month, we released a new report on seizing the U.S. infrastructure workforce opportunity, investing in current and future workers. This report aims to equip leaders with more consistent data and information to better target, measure, and address their infrastructure workforce needs. It builds off past Brookings research to provide an updated look at U.S. infrastructure employment, including the country's nearly 17 million workers employed across transportation, water, energy, broadband, and more. While these positions offer multiple career pathways across every region, particularly in the skilled trades, can pay competitive wages and pose lower formal educational barriers to entry, they have enormous hiring gaps, limiting the reach of this economic opportunity. Yes, there are projections of huge new job growth in construction and other activities due to new federal funding, up to 1.5 million new workers each year over the next decade. But projections also show that 1.7 million infrastructure workers, or about 10% of this workforce, will leave their jobs each year on average over the next decade too, due to retirements and other labor turnover. And this challenge is especially severe given declining labor participation rates across the economy and continued struggles hiring, training, and retaining women and people of color in the infrastructure space. In other words, while we focus on the shiny new object in front of us, it can be easy to overlook the cracking foundation of the country's current infrastructure workforce involved in construction, operation, and maintenance. How can leaders expand the future infrastructure workforce if they cannot even hold on to the current one? We're going to dig into that issue more during our discussion today. And second, just last week, in the context of these challenges, we released a new report on how state and local leaders can harness new infrastructure funding to build a stronger, more inclusive workforce. My colleagues Martha Ross, Annalise Goger, Felix Lanian, and I went through the 1,000+ pages of the IIJA, not just to save you time, but to pinpoint exactly which funding programs emphasize or allow workforce development activities, such as training and community outreach for recruitment. The reality is that even as the federal government passed and is in the process of directing $864 billion in IIJ funding across more than 400 different programs over the next 5 years, state and local leaders hold the most control over how infrastructure projects will ultimately be planned, designed, and implemented. And that includes the extent to which they rethink and prioritize workforce development needs. That includes state departments of transportation, state energy offices, water utilities, and many other infrastructure owners and operators who may know how to get projects done, but may not always be familiar or well-versed with existing education and workforce assets. Meanwhile, local and state workforce programs may not know how to focus their outreach and partnership efforts. That's a huge problem since the IIJA provides enormous flexibilities and eligibilities around workforce development, but little specific guidance on such funding. By our count, more than $490 billion across 72 different programs emphasize or allow workforce development activities, an enormous total speaking to the potential reach of these investments to help many different people and places, but also no guarantee that this money will actually end up going and doing that given prevailing business as usual approaches. We're going to dig into that issue today too. Both reports are publicly available on the Brookings site, and I encourage you to check them out. If you have any questions on the reports or that come up during today's discussion, you can also email those to events@brookings.edu or tweeting to @BrookingsMetro using the hashtag InfraWorkers. So with all that in mind, I'm excited to kick off our first panel on federal perspectives and want to invite our speakers to the stage. So yeah, you guys can come up. As we're settling in, I'm just going to give a quick round of introductions. And maybe I'll transition. Great. So first to my immediate left is Teresa Acuna, the Deputy Director of the Good Jobs Initiative at the U.S. Department of Labor, who I know is thinking about and coordinating among many different federal agencies on these workforce issues. To her left is Kevin Gallagher, a senior advisor to the Secretary at the U.S. Department of Commerce, who is especially focusing on broadband workforce issues. And last but certainly not least is Paige Shevlin, the Strategic Advisor for Infrastructure Workforce Development at the U.S. Department of Transportation, who is focusing on a variety of workforce issues across the transportation sector. Teresa, Kevin, and Paige, thanks so much for being here today and for joining another Brookings event in such a short span. I realize some of you were part of a similar conversation that my colleague Livia Brockman led only a couple months ago. I also realize you're all quite busy, but know you have such a close read on the pulse of these workforce issues. So I really appreciate your insights. So, to start, we know the country's infrastructure workforce needs are enormous, as I was just describing, including the need to hire, train, and retain millions of workers in the coming years. At the same time, there are now billions of dollars in new federal funding with the potential to address these needs. What is your agency doing to maximize this potential? I mean, how are you trying not to just target more funding for projects, but actually, help workers? And Paige, I think I'd like to start with you on this one, since DOT is the agency with the most funding overall to address these issues. And I know you're thinking about this really closely.
Thank you, and thank you for having me and the others from our federal agency partners, and great work too on the report on the funding opportunities. It's really challenging to distill how all of this funding can be used for workforce. So definitely a service to state and local entities for you all to do that. At the Department of Transportation, we are focused on making sure that as we implement this law and as we do the primary purpose of this law, which is to build things and construct things, that we create good jobs and that those jobs are accessible to a wider swath of the American public than they have been in the past, right? So they include more women, more people of color. And we have decided that in order to do that, we need to make three things top priorities. Number one, that we have standards around good jobs in all of our funding opportunities. Second, that we encourage the creation of more training programs, because we do realize that we need more pathways for people to get into these jobs, especially training programs that have supportive services and other elements that help underrepresented workers to get in. And then third, that we see a change in policies of the transportation agencies themselves in terms of how they recruit and hire workers. And all three of those things need to happen in order for our ultimate goal to be achieved, which is to create millions of good paying jobs that are inclusive of the entire population. And there are three different types of funding that I like to think about. One is our competitive funding. And so in our competitive funding, we are putting those three pieces into all of our notice of funding opportunities, and we are scoring applications based on whether or not we see those elements. Then we also have the rare opportunities. They're too few and far between, but we do have one opportunity where we were able to actually set standards, and that's in our electric vehicle charging program. And in that program, we are requiring that there be a registered apprentice on every single project, as well as other standards to make sure that those are good paying jobs. And then third, we have the formula programs that go to state and local entities and that we don't have a lot of control over. What we're trying to do there is issue really strong guidance, let states and localities know that those funds are available for workforce, and also let them know what we think is highest value. And I'm happy to get into later what we do want to see state and localities spend those funds on, but I will let you go to the next person.
Great, that's a great page, and I think that's what people are looking for is specific programs. I mean, this is such a big pot of money that could be transformational, but it's really hard to wrap your arms around, so it's great to hear what DOT is doing as it relates to electric vehicles and many other programs on that front. Kevin, turning to you, obviously you're focusing a lot on the broadband side of things here, another sort of infrastructure agency, if you will. Can you describe a little bit more about kind of what you're doing around these workforce issues, both now and kind of in the coming months and years?
Absolutely, and I think what's really important is you're going to see a significant amount of alignment. You're going to hear that our approach is very similar, for example, to the approach that Paige and her colleagues at DOT are taking. That's very intentional. We are, from the top down, from the president on down, the mission with investing the infrastructure funding is to create good jobs. And you're going to hear from Teresa in a minute about DOL's Good Jobs initiative, but it's serving as an umbrella for all of our work. And so like Paige mentioned, in the broadband NOFO, the IRA funding that NOAA received and the CHIPS funding that we received, those NOFOs aren't out yet, but you'll see consistently across those NOFOs attempts to embed workforce development as a key strategy for implementation, and where we can, a very intentional policy decision to allow funding to be used directly for workforce development. That's what we did on the broadband NOFO, and we said in the requirements of the program that every state, when they submit their plan, they need to include in their plan how they will make sure that there's a sufficient number of highly skilled workers needed to build out the networks that will help connect the unserved and underserved parts of the country, and gave states the flexibility to use that funding to set up the registered apprenticeship programs and the pathways needed to fill those jobs.
Yep, so not just sort of technical assistance, but actual explicit guidance of, hey, this is where workforce can come in to this funding opportunity. Here's how you can take advantage of that.
Exactly.
I know we'll get into that some more too. And Teresa, DOL obviously is a little more unique here in that you don't actually get a lot of money out of IIJA or some of this legislation, yet you've got all this wonderful responsibility to elevate workforce issues and coordinate obviously with DOT and Commerce and other agencies. And I know you're doing a lot of great work, as Kevin had said, on the Good Jobs initiative. Can you explain a little bit more about what that is and kind of some of the work that you're leading at DOL at the moment?
Sure, and thank you for the question and the invitation. We're really happy to share our work with this room. While the DOL is not explicitly mentioned in the bipartisan infrastructure law, we very much see a huge role in its implementation. And because we know that roads, bridges, the expansion of broadband is not going to happen on its own. We need people, we need workers, and we need a lot of them, and we need them quickly. So we knew that we had a role in all of this, and we've been quite just encouraged by the partnership and kind of the reception that we've had. This was also met during a time that you might remember there was a lot of conversation around the Great Recession. So bill passed the fall of 2021. We were feeling a lot of concerns of how we were already going to be filling in what was seen as a lot of workforce gaps. And the secretary, through his engagement, he's on the road a lot. He talks to a lot of people. And what a lot of conversations surrounded, and it was quite obvious, and data actually ended up supporting this hunch, is that there wasn't just a jobs or a worker shortage, there was a good job shortage. And so we knew that essentially if we had the window of opportunity, but if we were really going to be able to scale to the size that we had to do it and the timeline that we had to do it, we really had to move the needle on equity and the good jobs conversation. So that helped inspire the Good Jobs initiative, which he launched in early 2022. And what that essentially does is a few things. One, it provides information to workers. It helps partner with employers as they're thinking about their good job making strategies. But a bulk of our energy goes to provide technical assistance to bill funded agencies in how they're going to be informing their discretionary grants and how we can embed good job quality levers like pre-apprenticeship, apprenticeship, wraparound services to help, bring in folks that have been traditionally left out of these types of investments. And then last but not least, I just want to mention that while we have a modest funding source, unlike those of the favored child, DOT, we do DOL's ETA agency, for example, is investing $3 billion into its workforce development programs, and a lot of these opportunities can be braided with bill funds and our funds with an end goal of equity, of good job making, of making sure that we're creating a sustainable workforce.
Yeah, and kind of my second question, for all of you, but starting I think with you, Teresa, to build on that, each of your agencies, as you described, has a lot on its plate right now, and as much as there are new plans and programs and other efforts helping to accelerate action on all these workforce needs, we know it takes more than any single agency to do all this work by itself, and in particular, we know it takes infrastructure leaders collaborating with workforce leaders, which is why we have both of you represented on this stage. So Teresa, just starting with you, you kind of got into this a little bit, but maybe in a little more depth. I mean, how are you actually coordinating, with other agencies, not just DOT and Commerce? I mean, we know EPA and Department of Energy, to name just a couple more on these needs. FEMA, get the alphabet soup
all of them
ready here. To what extent is this cross-agency collaboration happening? I mean, I think we talk about it a lot of it being a nice thing to do, but how much is it actually really making a difference to address these needs across multiple agencies and infrastructure sectors?
Sure. So collaboration is at the heart of the Good Jobs Initiative. We don't have the funds, but we can help bring our resources and our expertise. And so operationally, what that looks like is that we tap into all of our agencies across DOL. And so for those that may not be familiar with all of our agencies, they're in charge of the enforcement compliance of a lot of rules as they relate to health and safety, minimum wage, et cetera, et cetera. We bring all of their expertise to help agencies that perhaps, they're experts in a lot of things, but maybe it's not workforce. Maybe it's not workforce compliance. We bring that up front, and what we hope to do is that we inform these dollars and these programs early on. This is to say, through our collaboration, we've established MOUs with transportation, commerce, and energy. What this essentially does is it spells out the way that we're going to work together in a common understanding of how we're going to do this work and kind of what are the big goals that we share. And in another spirit of collaboration, we've also worked closely with Commerce in defining what is a good job. So there's just so many ways that I think that one would think that federal government comes together and moves in the same direction, but we know that really doesn't happen. But we're actually doing it, and it's helping us in the work. Creating common definitions of what is and what isn't is also helpful. So that said, the Good Jobs Initiative, through our collaboration, we've helped inform $66 billion of funding throughout those three agencies, embedding good job quality standards, embedding equity levers that we know that can help scale and really bring in a workforce that would be a little bit more conclusive. And I think that, I'll turn it over to them, but that's kind of what we're doing.
Yeah, as a beneficiary of the Labor Department's good work, I can tell you that it helps us to have access to those experts. So I'll give you a very concrete example. As we were thinking about the design of the broadband programs, one thing we had heard over and over was about the health and safety requirements that were going to be needed on these job sites. These are not job sites that exist in any one place for any one moment in time. They're mobile, right? If you're laying miles of fiber, you're in a different location every day. And so the health and safety aspects of a job site like that are different than a job site where you're building a vertical construction and you're on the same site for multiple years. We were able to get access to the experts at Labor who helped us think through what do the requirements around health and safety need to look like in our NOFO. And I think you'll see across all of our notice of funding opportunities common embedded language and approaches that are informed by the Good Jobs Initiative. I think there's another really important concrete example of our cross-agency collaboration, and that's really the work that's being led by Mitch Landrieu and his team at the White House. So the president was very intentional about establishing an infrastructure coordinator at the federal level whose responsibility is to bring us together at the staff level and at the principal level to have these conversations to make sure that we're working in concert and that there is strong communication between all the agencies. The Good Jobs Initiative being one of multiple examples. It's happening on permitting. It's happening across supply chains and Made in America. There's lots of common issues that as agencies who have to implement this funding that we're going to face that we don't have to tackle individually. We come together and we get the benefit of all of our collective agencies' expertise to solve them.
Yeah, and I'll give another concrete example as well. We recently, it was this past fall, put out a checklist for potential applicants on how to create a strong workforce and labor plan as a part of their applications. And we did that in partnership with the Department of Labor, reviewing every single word. We also tried to make sure that as much as possible it matched with previous documents that Commerce has been putting out. We want to make sure that the applicant community understands that we're all looking for the same thing and give some more detailed information because we use a lot of shorthand, right? So in our notice of funding opportunities, we will always say we want to see high quality workforce development programs with supportive services, right? Because we have very few words that we can use. What does that really mean? So the checklist is meant to explain how do you ensure that you're using high quality workforce development programs? What are supportive services? How do you incorporate them into your project plan? And how do you incorporate them with community partners who can make sure that those supportive services are going to achieve the goal of bringing more underrepresented populations into the workforce? And so it's just one example of a product that we've created in partnership with the Department of Labor that honestly, I am a workforce expert. I couldn't have done that on my own, right? I mean,
by the way, if you haven't seen it, I would highly encourage you to take a look. We liked it so much, we just stole it and incorporated it into our broadband program. So,
And we
but
like
it took
that.
a lot of staff work from the Department
all
of
our
Labor.
Yeah, and you could, and just for everyone's knowledge, you can find all of this material and so much more at goodjobs.gov.
That's great. Yeah, I think because a lot of people are looking where this lives, right? And we know there's a bunch of PDFs and links all over the place, and so it's great to know there are places where people can look. I mean, we've been talking a lot about federal efforts, especially from your seats in Washington, but I want to get beyond the Beltway a little bit. A major conclusion in our research and in your work, I know, as you've been kind of alluding to, is the central importance of state and local leaders, right? That are trying to harness all this infrastructure funding to address the country's workforce needs. And how are you coordinating with state and local leaders, right? Obviously, you're coordinating among yourselves, but what steps have you taken to bridge those silos? I think that are really common among some of the infrastructure leaders and workforce leaders on the ground. And Kevin, I was curious, can you take this one first?
Sure. The amount of federal money that we're talking about is staggering. I mean, any one of the bills that you rattled off is a historic accomplishment. When you pile all of them on top of one another, it creates a very long to-do list. And the amount of money is just simply unprecedented. I mean, we're talking about trillions of dollars. And it's true in broadband, and I'm relatively confident it's true for the transportation funding too. The vast majority of that money goes to states and local governments. So we play an important role, but we're actually not the ones out there doing the actual work. And so we need to build really strong partnerships with our state and local counterparts to support them as they go through the execution of these projects, because they are the ones ultimately who are receiving the vast amount of the money that we're talking about. And so our goal is to be really good partners and to have excellent lines of communication. I'll give you two examples of the way in which we're going about that. The first goes back to the appointment of Mayor Landrieu as the infrastructure coordinator. one of the first things he did was he reached out to governors and asked governors to appoint state-level infrastructure coordinators who would be responsible at the state level to make sure the state DOT and the state broadband office and the state environmental agency were working together and coordinating their implementation. And we, at the federal level, talk to those state-level infrastructure coordinators all the time. We have regular meetings with them. They come to DC on a regular basis, and it's very helpful that the point people at each federal agency have access to the point person at the state level who's in charge of implementation. For broadband in particular, we made a very intentional decision that we needed to hire program staff not in DC, but in the states. And so every state now has a state broadband office. Most of them are new and small, but mighty, and they're doing excellent work. And we've paired each one of them with a federal point person. We did not want a state broadband office to have to email a generic email address and hope that the right person finds their email and gets them the answer to the question. There is a human being, most of the time based right in that state. They have their name, cell phone number, email. They're in regular meetings with each other. And so the state broadband office in Pennsylvania has a partner who's also waking up in the morning and going to bed at night, figuring out what is my role at the federal level in helping that state be successful in their broadband plans.
That's great, and that's just within broadband too.
And I would just say, go to internetforall.gov. There's an interactive map. You can click on your state, and you can see the name of the state broadband person who's in charge and their email address, and you can find the federal person who's in charge of that state and their email address. And so that's like a great way, not just to stay coordinated at the federal level, but for local partners who want to get involved in their state broadband planning process and don't know how. Their names and emails are right on the website, and you should feel free to reach out to them.
That's great. And, Paige, turning to you, transportation, obviously, coordination with state departments of transportation and beyond. I mean, huge level of coordination there. I know, as you said, you came up with a checklist, other ways I think that you're helping these leaders. But did you want to expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. Because the checklist is a product, right? And, we've put out products. The Department of Labor has put out products, right? They have a employment training notice to all of their workforce system partners on how they can partner with transportation. Those products don't work unless we actually talk to people about how to use them. So really my personal goal for this year is to talk to as many state and local leaders as possible. So if you're out there listening, I really do mean it. I sometimes, will talk to state departments of transportation, city governments. am happy to sit down and talk. One of the things we're trying to do is actually start coordinating transportation and workforce agencies by region, and then really kind of getting them all in the same room and trying to explain how they can coordinate using these tools, because I think it's overwhelming and the silos are real, right? I mean, it's not just that they don't know who to contact, it's that they don't expect that they'll get a response. The workforce and the transportation folks have never worked together, and especially at the local level, I would say, because I think at the local level, there's an additional challenge of who do you contact, right? The state level, it's pretty clear. We want state departments of labor, state workforce boards, state departments of education to be working with the State Department of Transportation. There's a smaller number of entities. But at the local level, we are giving money to ports, we're giving money to transit agencies, we're giving money to, city departments of transportation. There are so many different ways in which those organizations are configured, and that's confusing for the workforce partners to understand. And then the transportation partners have no idea what a workforce board is. So we're really trying our best to get to as many folks as we can. Ultimately, the responsibility does rest with local leaders. And I really wish that every city and every state would appoint an infrastructure workforce coordinator in addition to their regular infrastructure coordinators, because I think it's a whole different challenge to figure out how to braid and blend all the funding that's available. It's always been a challenge within the workforce and human service system, and now we're adding the transportation system and saying, here, you can use some of this funding for workforce, but in ways that are complicated for people to understand. expand. So we're definitely trying to get that information out there. And I would really encourage states and localities to make sure that they are appointing those individuals who can really convene all the leaders in the local area and come up with a plan of how they're going to use our funding, right? Our funding can be used for jobs on the project, and that's something we really want to see more of. There's a few cities who have done that, but you can use that funding to support someone who goes to underserved communities and actively recruits people to jobs. You can use that funding for some of the supportive services to support people who are apprentices on the project. And so we do want to make sure that our funding gets used, and we also want to make sure that states and localities know how to use all the other funding that's out there.
Yep. Couldn't have said it better myself. Teresa, did you want to add anything, especially from the workforce perspective?
Yeah, I would just add, echo everything that has been said, but really the way that this is going to be felt on the ground is that everyone is at the table. And what we encourage state and locals is that they convene these tables with labor, unions, private sector, et cetera, everyone that has a stake in this early, because it's actually a competitive edge. So in applying, working together and having everyone's interest up front and having everyone's resources, whether that be a union that has a pre-apprenticeship or an apprenticeship, though that is a competitive edge as you're seeking a lot of dollars. So we hope that they see the value in this. And also, let's just say that they get the funds approved. So there's going to be some, coordination and research involved of like what exactly your local and state is going for. Let's just say they got the funds. This doesn't keep you from actually approaching them after the fact and entering, agreements, whether it could be community workforce agreements, et cetera. So I'll leave it there.
I have a feeling that our second panel will get even deeper into the state local issues, which is kind of the intention of this. We're going to tee up some of these issues for them. I'm already looking at the clock, and I know we're already reaching almost time. So I want to try to transition to some Q&A, actually, from some questions that we've already received from some of our viewers who are tuning in. And something that we've touched on, maybe this is more of like a lightning round, a couple of these questions, so feel free to jump in. The issue of equity, right? And, we're talking about workforce broadly, big programs, a lot of money. One question here that I'll just read directly, unemployment is low, leading to a shortage of workers, but there are disparities among racial and ethnic groups that are quite large. In what ways can these infrastructure investments and workforce development priorities help bring the full employment of Black and Hispanic communities? And the related question we got to that is, how are these efforts actually intentionally reaching out to women as well, who tend to be underrepresented in these careers? If any of you wanted to take a swing at that.
How about I take the first step?
Go ahead.
Okay. So we have a few, thank you for the question. That's top of mind. What was the point of all of this if it's not like every person that lives here can feel the benefits of this? So that's absolutely not lost on us. I'll lift a few tools. One is our mega project that is out of our OCCP office, which is essentially a technical assistance program that helps with the compliance. So this is very early on helping convene all of the folks on the ground. This is actually happening where the projects are set to be taking place, and that is an advantage. So certain projects that will be over $35 million are eligible, and they'll be getting this compliance assistance from Department of Labor as it relates to megas. And that is a big equity tool because, again, it's on the ground. It helps really understand what the workforce and the community and the diversity and the potential of those workers and helping them bring them in. Maybe the tool is pre-apprenticeship. Maybe it's apprenticeship. Maybe it's wraparound services. Maybe, childcare and transportation tend to be one of the biggest impediments. Even just in a pre-apprenticeship, people can't get to where they want to be because of other commitments. So it's, thinking through kind of like all of the other aspects of like really seeing the worker and like all of their dynamics is the way that we're really going to achieve that.
Yeah, I just wanted to add a little bit onto that. We are definitely taking the incentive approach and again, scoring applications based on what we see with regard to their plans for bringing in underrepresented groups and also their past performance on it, right? Because ideally, we would see that they're already performing well on this. But we also have taken the step to require, where possible, that all of our grantees will be willing participants in the Department of Labor's mega grants program. That means that if those departments of transportation are reached out to by the Department of Labor for this compliance assistance, they have to say yes. And that's a very important tool to make sure that they know and understand and convene all the right stakeholders in order to reach the goals that they are required to meet. And we also remind our applicants of those goals in every single notice of funding opportunity right now, that they are supposed to be working toward having 7%, about 7% of women on the project, and a certain fraction of people of color, depending on that particular geographic region.
I would just say that we've talked a lot about both the levers and the rules, but I actually think that there is a real need that regardless of the rules of the programs that we are going to see, that can only be filled by increasing the diversity, particularly in the construction industry. The construction industry is the industry that will see the greatest amount of job growth. The largest number of workers that we'll need on broadband projects are construction workers. That's going to also be true for DOT, for energy, for interior, for EPA. And the opportunity, I think, is real, because occupations in the construction industry are among the highest paying jobs that someone can get without a college degree. So from an equity play and from a good job standard, we see it as a real opportunity for the industry as a whole to take steps to become more diverse, and through a combination of the rules and tools that you're hearing about, necessity, based on the question, the labor market challenges are real, and also like to seize the opportunity as a moment in time that we will not see maybe ever again. This level of investment combined with this current state of the labor market means that anybody who wants to grow their talent pool has to be thinking about issues around diversity and equity.
Yep. I know we're effectively at time. I'm looking at our events. Yeah. I've got more questions I wish I could ask, but please, everyone, thank our outstanding panel for their insights.
Thank you. Thanks.
And I'm really happy to be handing the mic now over to my colleague, Martha Ross, who will be leading our state and local panel.
Panelists, come on up. So I'm very pleased to be here kicking off this panel. As we're settling in, I'm going to give some introductions. I'm Martha Ross, Senior Fellow here at Brookings Metro. We have Robert Blaine, Senior Executive and Director, Institute for Youth Education and Families at the National League of Cities. Next to him, we have Grace Lowe, Program Manager with the National Association of State Energy Officials. And last but not least, we have Robert Puentes, President and CEO, Eno Center for Transportation. And before we get started with questions, I'm going to make a few remarks to set the stage. As Joe Kane mentioned, he and I, along with colleagues Annalise Goger and Felix Lanahan, read through this bill, you're welcome, to identify programs emphasizing or allowing workforce development activities, which we defined as those related to recruiting, community outreach, training, and hiring workers. And by our count, as Joe said, there's more than $490 billion across 72 programs that emphasize or allow workforce activities. So most of these dollars will go directly towards program costs, which is exactly appropriate. But even a small share dedicated towards workforce activities would make a huge difference. Think about building career pathways into infrastructure jobs, creating more advancement opportunities for incumbent workers, broadening and diversifying the infrastructure worker pool so that it's younger and more diverse. And most of the funding that we tallied, almost 80% or $385 billion, are formula funds. And you heard the previous panelists discuss that a bit. And the reason that matters is because these funds go to designated state and local entities, and they have pretty established processes and priorities for how money is awarded and governed. A smaller share, but still more than $100 billion, go through competitive funds. And competitive funds provide much more leeway for federal officials to design how the programs should be run, and they allow for a broader range of organizations to apply to receive them. And just as within the overall bill, the Department of Transportation gets the most funding that emphasizes or allows workforce development. $352 billion. But agencies such as the Department of Commerce, Environmental Protection Agency, Department of Energy, they're also sending out billions and billions of dollars to state and local governments through EJA. So this is a cross-agency effort through the federal government. So now, as we've heard, attention shifts to state and local leaders who hold the most control over how these projects are planned, designed, and implemented. And whether they realize it or not, a key task is to make sure that when infrastructure jobs open up, there are workers to fill them. And this is not a concern just for people whose jobs revolve around workforce development. This is a concern for anyone who wants to make sure that the jobs get done, which means it is a concern for everyone. The infrastructure field has long faced challenges with recruiting and retaining workers. It does not have a strong record of inclusion and diversity. If state and local leaders act strategically, they can harness EJA funding to make both short and long-term investments to strengthen this workforce, invest in the next generation of infrastructure talent. If they continue to treat recruitment, training, advancement, career pathways as an afterthought, then we're going to miss that opportunity. So now, let's turn to our panel to discuss these issues in more detail. So first, I'm going to turn to Rob Puentes. I've got a two-parter for you. First, can you say a bit about the Eno Center for Transportation? And then I'd like to get your thoughts on the hundreds of billions of dollars that are flowing from the U.S. Department of Transportation to state transportation agencies, and specifically their role in building out a more diverse and inclusive infrastructure workforce.
Thanks, Martha, very much. Thank you for having me here. The Eno Center for Transportation is a 100-year-old public policy organization, so we're actually younger than Brookings, so that's amazing. But, we are focused on transportation, planes, trains, and automobiles, but we are trying to branch out transportation, so it's talking about all those things that we know transportation is connected to, because if we are just transportation people talking to transportation people, we get transportation outcomes, and that's okay. You need to do that, but if you can talk about other things like workforce, like housing, like all the things we know it's connected to, you've exponentially increased the audience for all of this work. And so that matters today because of the things that we're talking about this afternoon. State transportation departments, and all across the transportation spectrum, honestly, we're experiencing tremendous transportation shortages even before the infrastructure bill. So this is in the news all the time. We see airlines, transit agencies, truck drivers, things like that. Now, with all of this money that's coming from the federal government, all those problems are amplified and and really doubled. So everything you were saying, Martha, is exactly right. That this really does represent a significant shift for state departments of transportation to be talking differently about their workforce needs in the future, and talking about not just filling jobs, but getting better and better quality jobs. Of the $361 billion that's going for roads and bridges in the infrastructure bill, about 90% of that is going to the state DOTs. So to your point, they have an enormous amount of responsibility and a big role here. And even though there isn't really money that's going directly for workforce programs in this legislation, the 4 core highway programs are almost entirely flexible, right? So what that means is the federal government is handing it down to the states, and the states can spend that money on almost any conceivable workforce plan that they want to do or program. They could do it for workforce development, for education, for training. All of that stuff is available and open for states to do what they want with it. We haven't seen that much uptake yet, despite the great efforts of the department, because it is a big shift, right? It's really requiring them to join up better with workforce agencies and think very differently about not just the workforce challenges they have today, but the workforce challenges of the future. So even though the money is flexible, we need to see a better uptake. We need to see the states using it much better. And I know that Paige and the department is trying to do that. Hopefully that's what's going to happen over the next few years.
Thank you. Next is a question for Robert Blaine, another two-parter. I'd like to start by asking you to describe the Local Infrastructure Hub, which is an initiative that the National League of Cities is part of, which helps to describe all of the opportunities within the infrastructure bill. So, and then after you do that, can you say a few words about what you've seen, what you've observed among local governments about their levels of readiness and preparation?
Thank you for that. So the Local Infrastructure Hub is a resource for communities to really think about how they can engage with the IIJA funding. One of the challenges that we saw early on was that large communities, big cities, right, have embedded infrastructure in order to be able to apply for these competitive federal programs. If you're in a small to mid-sized city, it's really difficult to compete because that infrastructure within the city government doesn't exist. Prior to coming to the National League of Cities, I was the chief administrative officer for the city of Jackson, Mississippi. Jackson's been in the news a lot recently, specifically about infrastructure challenges. And running the city of Jackson, I had 2.5 grant writers. I had one in the planning department, I had one in public safety, and many of the grants that were coming down around public safety were around militarization of our police, which was the exact opposite of where we were trying to go. And I had a grant writer in public works. There was zero opportunity, and this is a city of nearly 170,000 residents, for us to be able to apply for competitive funding for these federal programs. So we started having a set of conversations with Mitch Landrieu and the folks in the White House about equity, looking at cities and their opportunities to be able to engage with this competitive funding. And so from those conversations and partnering with the Bloomberg Philanthropies and a whole set of philanthropies that actually came together around this effort, the Local Infrastructure Hub was launched. And the National League of Cities specifically is building out what we've called the boot camps, which is a curriculum that walks a city through the process of creating high-quality competitive applications for these funding streams. And we really think of this as the first step into the workforce conversation, right? So the first step is essentially opening the spigot and getting those that funding moving down to the local level, and then to really be a part of the design process when the cities are really thinking about how they're incorporating their local workforce strategy, how the mayor serves as the convener to bring together all of the components of a local workforce ecosystem, and then how that's embedded in the application. And then the second step of the process is really thinking about fidelity to what that application is, and then how do we really build compliance so that cities are great stewards of the funds that are coming down.
Thank you. Grace, I'd like to start by asking you to describe your organization, the National Association of State Energy Officials, and then say a bit as well about what state energy offices do and the money that the infrastructure bill is sending their way.
Yeah, of course. So NASIO, the National Association of State Energy Officials, is a national nonprofit membership association for the 56 state and territory energy officials. And we help facilitate peer learning. We provide resources and support for the state energy offices, as well as advocating for their interests. So if you're not familiar with state energy offices, they are governor designated, and their name and position within state government tends to vary by state, but we tend to think of them as entities that receive U.S. State Energy Program funding, or SEP, which is flexible, appropriated dollars that can be used for state energy planning and program design and development. And so, like I said, their priorities and their capacities tend to vary by state, depending on their resources, the community's needs, as well as where they're housed within state government. However, their work typically includes developing energy plans and strategies, informing policy, legislative, and regulatory decisions, analyzing market trends relevant to their state's priorities, supporting research, development, and deployment of energy technologies and programs. And so their work touches a wide array of infrastructure jobs within energy, everything from energy efficiency and weatherization to clean hydrogen and solar, wind, everything in between. And I think most state energy offices are very aware that workforce development is critical to not only building those projects and successfully rolling out those programs, but also ensuring that it brings wealth building opportunities to their communities. And so within IIJA or bill, there are sort of three categories of funding that are relevant for state energy offices interested in workforce development. So the first one is very direct, explicit funding for workforce development. And then there's also very flexible funds that could be used for workforce development. And then the last is those competitive opportunities. So just picking a few, I think the Energy Auditor Training Program is a big one. It's $40 million, and it's directly to be used for any cost associated with energy auditor training. And it also encourages applicants to really connect those trainees to job opportunities after they complete their training. On the flexible side of things, I think EECBG, or Energy Efficiency Conservation Block Grants, are great. Also a wonderful way to partner with local governments. And those are really flexible, and DOE has actually recently released guidance that elevates workforce development as a sort of blueprint or a roadmap that states can use. And then lastly, the hydrogen opportunity is a competitive one that a lot of states are looking at. And the Department of Energy has required a community benefits plan as part of those applications. So encouraging states to plan to negotiate a project labor agreement, thinking about diversity, equity, and inclusion in their plans, as well as Justice 40 goals.
Thanks. This next question is for either of the Roberts. So as state and local governments carry out these EJA-funded projects, state and local departments of employment and workforce development boards have just a wealth of knowledge and expertise to offer. But given that they are not among the directly funded entities, they may not be at the table. Are you seeing this play out at the state and local level? And what words of wisdom do you have to encourage state and local actors to make sure these two, that the twain shall meet?
So one of the real challenges is that if there are not pre-existing relationships that are already in place and durable, it's difficult to build those relationships on the fly. And one of the things that we're seeing in communities is that as a part of the planning process, we're trying to encourage those relationships to if they're not already there, to really start to foster those relationships and to be intentional about what assets are available in your local community. So as a part of the process that we've been doing with cities, the first stage is to really think of asset mapping. Who are the assets what are the assets you have in your community? Who are the people that need to be at the table? How do we convene that table? And then how are we really intentional about what the goals of this work is? And then how are we being inclusive and making sure that that table is working together to get there? The last piece of this really gets to thinking of workforce in a community, both with the workforce board, but then also the local community of small businesses, minority serving businesses, all of those businesses that can then be a part of that project. And this is really starting to think about how a project can be broken down. So, often it's the large engineering firm that's in that community that takes the prime on that project. But if you're doing a road project and you can break out a contract just for the people that wave the flags, right? That's a company that can be built into that community, and you can be intentional about that workforce that's doing that. So thinking about how a community is intentional about the work and how they're leveraging the assets that they have internally, I think is a really important part of the design and really implementing a project that's going to create outcomes in a community.
Asset mapping, relationship building, thinking strategically about how to break out components of the project, and what different communities or actors in a given area can take the leadership role in carrying out different parts of an infrastructure project. Robert?
Yeah, I'll just say it's a little bit different with the State Department of Transportation, because especially the formula money, not getting too wonky, the formula money that the states get comes with very little strings, right? The federal government, the states kind of think this is their money, the federal government's just kind of holding it. So it goes to the states. And so it is really flexible, and they can do a lot of things that they want with that money. But this is a big challenge for them. And a lot of this is based on work that we undertook with the Markle Foundation and with NASIO, actually, to look at, well, how can we actually get them to spend this money for the stuff we're talking about here, high road, job development efforts, and really innovative stuff. And once we started talking to them, we realized we're not even there yet. We have to actually roll this back a little bit, because, as we said before, this isn't really what they do. This isn't really how they think. It was hard for us to find, well, who are the right people at these state DOTs to talk to? And do they know the workforce boards in their state? Most of the time they didn't. Most of the times the workforce development people and the state DOT people hadn't even been in the same room together. They just don't have that natural communication that's going on. We know that states are siloed, but this is something that we thought we really had to address. So I think it's possible, and when we start talking to states, they get it and they understand. They're very acutely aware of the workforce development challenges, but they're looking for, there's a lot of inertia, right? So for them to do something different, for them to take advantage of the flexibility is kind of an unnatural act. That's not the way I mean to say it. It's not natural for them to do this. That wasn't even much better, actually. But the point is, they want to do the right thing. And so there is replication that's out there. They do like to see what else is happening. What did they learn in this place? How can I take that and tailor it? There's really great projects out there. We heard about the Central 70 project through downtown Denver, where there's a big $1 billion redevelopment project. They're doing local hire. They're working with the community. They're doing wraparound services. So that's a great thing that people are like, wow, that's great. How do I do that in my state? The Illinois Tollway Authority is doing interesting things. Oregon DOT is trying to bring in more racial and gender equity into some construction jobs. So there is good things that are out there. We just need to do a better job of pulling those out and showing other states what they can do and how they can tailor and replicate those for their own places.
Let me ask a follow-up question based on something that you said about the flexibility of the formula funds. So states have a great deal of flexibility. What we heard from the previous panel is the U.S. Department of Transportation is spending a lot of energy to say, like, this is possible, this is doable, this is desirable. But given the the strictures of the law, there's still a tremendous amount of flexibility built into these dollars. So what you're saying is at the state and local level, this guidance from above, from the federal Department of the U.S. Transportation, needs to be matched by energy at the state and local level.
Yeah, precisely. And it's the flexibility is fantastic. I mean, and it's really unprecedented, and it really is for almost anything they want to do. But you start talking to states, and their kind of the reaction is, well, anything you're peeling away from our program is taken away from the transportation needs we have. Building roads, maintaining roads, there's an awful lot of needs in this country, and so that mindset is hard to change. So that's one thing we have to get beyond. And so I think that's the biggest challenge we have.
Grace, I'd like to ask you a question. Rob just name-checked a couple of good examples of transportation projects involving workforce development. Can you speak to some state energy office efforts in that regard?
Definitely, yeah. Lots of examples I could pull out, but just to highlight a few, I think in New York, they have a really comprehensive program. The state energy office is NYSERDA, the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority, and they've dedicated over $120 million towards clean energy workforce development over the next few years. And one in particular is their on-the-job training program, and specifically it allows for covering up to 75% of wages for new workers. So in their first 4 to 6 months, it can help businesses train those workers and do the work on the job. And they also have a higher amount that they provide for minority and women-owned businesses, as well as businesses that are hiring certain priority populations. Another example, North Carolina has built a lot of partnerships across the state, and these collaborations have led to first a pilot program in summer of 2021, a pre-apprenticeship program, and now it is expanding into a full statewide program that's really aimed at bringing training and utilizing the network of colleges, universities, HBCUs to bear, and making sure that it's targeted in geographic and sector-based, with a geographic-based approach. And then lastly, I'll just plug Mississippi has an interesting program that's really focused on innovation and inclusive innovation. So they have a V-Quad innovation cluster that attempts to connect 4 research universities, including Jackson State University, with emerging entrepreneurs across the state to really focus on energy technologies and commercializing those. So,
thank you. We now have time for some audience Q&A.
Jay Lim, United Parcel Service. More of a comment than a question. Just want to give credit to the speakers on the prior panel and the approach that this administration has taken in not only coordinating across federal agencies and reaching out to state and locals, but there's been an explicit effort to get the private sector involved. And UPS, as an employer of 450,000 employees in the US, 350,000 of which are unionized, we're in every jurisdiction and district. We're trying to work with every workforce development board and state DOT agency to take advantage of apprenticeships and all these other fundings that you guys have for underserved communities, doing wraparound services, providing childcare centers in our facilities, providing transportation for folks to take public transportation 2 hours each way just to be a package handler. But I just want to, and UPS was invited, was one of the first companies invited by Secretary Walsh to the Good Jobs Initiative panel last May. And there was a big-sized company, middle-sized company, a small-sized company. And I think that's the missing piece, like getting the private sector involved so that other companies can see this is how employers can come along and connect with these local, state, and federal efforts. Because even for us as a huge company, it's hard to navigate the state-by-state system where you have to become like an eligible training provider, there's apprenticeships, there's all these other funds. And as a policy staffer based in DC, I'm training UPS's HR staff on how to actually tap into these funds. So if that's a challenge for us as a publicly traded Fortune 25 company, I can only imagine what other small and medium-sized businesses face in terms of barriers, right? They don't know these programs exist. They don't know how to actually take advantage of them. But I want to give kudos to everyone on this panel and the others, because there's efforts being made to reach out to the private sector, training us and using us as models. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, and thank you all for your time. My name is Charlene, and I work at Mentor, the National Mentoring Partnership. So my question is going to be about mentoring. So, good people on the panel, I want to ask, how are your agencies engaging and incorporating mentoring practices into implementing policy, but also encouraging your partner agencies in mentoring supports as well?
If I can, I'd like to take moderator's prerogative for a moment on that and say that I think one of the most important elements of mentoring is a supportive relationship between two people, and it's often between a supervisor and a worker, or between some caring person and another person. So it may be that it is not described as mentoring in the workforce initiatives, but it is nonetheless, the components are nonetheless there. The reason I'm saying that is because sometimes I think the word mentoring scares workforce development people, because they think of it as something that Boys and Girls Clubs do with teens, when actually it is much, much broader and should be much more used across all ages.
I would just add to that, when we start to talk about incorporating local workforce of color, and especially small businesses in local communities, and when we're looking at some of these large projects where you have these large engineering firms, for example, that may be the prime on one of those contracts, there is a mentoring relationship, for example, between the primes and their subs. And being able to bring in a set of subs at the local level that are, we used to call them in Jackson, truly engaged subs, right? There have been some historical practices around engaging subs where there wasn't true work that was being happened. It was actually leveraging a relationship in order to be able to get a contract. And so how do we actually make sure that there are real work experiences that are really creating tangible results in the community? And that comes from that kind of goal setting and being able to create that table with those relationships, so that we're ensuring that the local workforce is actually gaining the benefits, right, that are coming through from these funding opportunities.
Thank you all. Mike Bartlett, National League of Cities. I realize it's cheating for me to ask a question here, but I actually want to build on the comment and turn it into a question about small businesses, small and mid-sized businesses. We know most Americans work at small and mid-sized businesses, but if you think of a small manufacturer, 25 employees, the CEO is going to be the HR director, the IT director, and so many other functions. So their capacity to kind of even be parts of these conversations is limited. And this is kind of a comment for the Department of Commerce, but is super relevant at the local level, is how do we help kind of the traditional field of economic development see their role in engaging small businesses in particular as also inclusive of talent development and professional development of HR staff, including CEOs and folks at that level in small and mid-sized businesses? That's not how they operate. It's a lot more business attraction and ribbon cutting. But would just love your all's thoughts and others too.
I have to give a plug for mayors, right? They are the CEOs of their cities. And they have a real opportunity to really think about what that workforce ecosystem looks like and what the priorities are in that community. And the inclusivity of those priorities is a part of building that table. And so mayors have an incredible amount of power when it comes to setting the stage of what a community sees as their goals. And then, it spills down, right? So how are those resources being allocated, how they're being shared, et cetera, so that a community is able to work comprehensively towards those goals.
I'm going to take a question that came in from the internet. And we actually got two questions about the role of AmeriCorps and service year programs in helping to develop infrastructure workforce pipelines. So I'd like to ask the panelists if you have seen that or have any thoughts on how to make sure that works.
Sure, I can start. So I think those programs are a great way to help expand pathways to clean energy careers and really give folks like on-the-job training. And I think state energy offices are really well positioned to partner with organizations like Service Year Alliance. One example that comes to mind is, again, the NYSERDA program and their on-the-job training program. One of the priority populations that they list as being eligible for a higher amount of funding is graduates of service year programs. So I think that's just one example.
If I can step in just to give another example, in LA, they have set up a articulation agreement between their AmeriCorps program and the registered apprenticeship program for, I believe it's the laborers, but one of the crafts there. And that makes sure that those opportunities lead into those sort of good paying jobs with union choice that we want to make sure that people have access to.
Thank you. We are at time, I'm afraid. I will close us out by saying there is no simple answer to the question about how much money is available in the infrastructure bill for workforce development. It is happening. That decision is being made every day in real time by state and local leaders. And we all have the chance to try to inform those decisions to make sure it's being used as effectively as possible. Thank you.